They were already laughing at her before she even stepped into the light, not knowing that within minutes, the most powerful man in the room would lower his head in front of her. The penthouse sat 40 stories above Seoul, glass walls reflecting a skyline of steel and gold, where crystal chandeliers shimmered over tailored suits and silk gowns, where every voice carried confidence, and every glance measured worth. And at the entrance, just beyond the velvet rope, an old woman stood in shoes. Worn thin at the soles, her coat too light for the evening chill, her hands folded calmly as if she had all the time in the world. "Ma'am, this event is private," the security guard said, not unkindly but firmly, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, already deciding she did not belong. And behind him, a cluster of guests turned, curiosity shifting quickly into quiet amusement. Whispers forming like ripples across the polished room. Because in a place where watches cost more than cars and laughter was filtered through champagne, someone like her became a spectacle. Inside, Mai froze mid-step, a silver tray trembling slightly in her hands as she recognized the silhouette instantly. The way her grandmother always stood straight no matter the weight life placed on her shoulders. The way her presence carried something unshakable, something the room could not read but instinctively dismissed. "That woman is with you," one guest murmured, loud enough to be heard, his tone coated in disbelief, and another followed with a soft chuckle. "This isn't a charity event." While a woman in a sleek black dress leaned closer, her voice smooth but edged, "You should know better than to bring that here," and the words didn't need to finish because the meaning had already landed. Mai felt her throat tighten, heat rising behind her eyes as she set the tray down and moved quickly toward the entrance, her heart pounding with each step. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice low, controlled. Almost practiced, the kind of apology that came from years of knowing when to shrink. She didn't mean to interrupt. "I'll take her away." But her grandmother didn't move, didn't lower her gaze, didn't react to the murmurs or the glances that slid over her like she was invisible. Instead, she looked into the room with a quiet steadiness, as if she had seen rooms like this before, as if she understood something they didn't. The guard shifted, uncertain now, glancing back at the guests who had begun to gather, their interest growing sharper, more entertained, and from across the marble floor, the host's fiancée approached, her heels clicking with precision, her expression composed but unmistakably displeased. "This is inappropriate," she said, her voice carrying just enough to silence nearby conversations. "Remove her." And for a moment, everything held still, the air tightening, the music fading into the background as all eyes turned toward the small figure at the door and the maid standing beside her, head slightly bowed, shoulders tense, caught between duty and something deeper, something she could not explain, while the old woman simply stood there, hands steady, eyes clear, as if she had already lived through the judgment of rooms far colder than this one, and somewhere beyond the glass walls. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, unnoticed by most, but not by the man who stepped out, his presence quiet yet undeniable, his gaze already drawn toward the entrance before anyone spoke his name. Mai's breath caught as the room shifted its attention, not because of her apology, but because of the subtle change in the air that only a few could feel at first, a quiet tension that moved like a shadow across polished marble and crystal light. And at the far end of the penthouse, Kang Ji-hyun slowed his steps without a word, his tailored suit catching the glow of the chandeliers as conversations around him faded instinctively. Because when he entered a room, people noticed even when they pretended not to, and now his eyes were fixed on something that did not belong, or rather, something everyone else believed did not belong. Mai stood between her grandmother and the gathering crowd, her fingers curling tightly at her sides as she lowered her gaze, forcing her voice steady. "Please, we will leave," she said, but the fiancé did not move, her expression sharpening as she glanced briefly toward the approaching figure of the boss, and then back at the old woman, calculating, measuring the situation in a heartbeat. "No," she said softly, her tone controlled but cold. "She needs to understand this is not a place for people like her." And a few guests nodded, their confidence returning now that authority had spoken. One man Lifting his glass with a faint smirk, "Standards matter," he added under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. The security guard hesitated, shifting his weight as if waiting for final confirmation, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air, unsure whether to guide the woman out or step back entirely, because something about her stillness unsettled him in a way he could not explain, and I felt the moment stretching too long. The eyes, the judgment, the quiet cruelty wrapped in politeness, pressing against her chest until it was hard to breathe. "Grandma, please," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to betray the effort it took to remain composed. But the old woman did not respond, not with words, not with movement, only with a calm gaze that drifted past the crowd and settled somewhere deeper in the room, as if she were looking for someone, or perhaps remembering something long buried beneath time and distance. Kang Ji-hyun stopped several feet away, unnoticed by most, his presence absorbed into the tension before it could be acknowledged, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the scene without interruption. The bowed posture of the maid, the rigid authority of his fiancée, the circle of guests waiting for resolution. And at the center of it all, the old woman who refused to bend, and something about that refusal, quiet but absolute, caught his attention in a way nothing else that evening had. He did not speak yet, did not reveal himself. Instead he watched, his gaze lowering slowly to the woman's hands. And for the first time, the steady rhythm of the room faltered, because those hands, lined with age but unshaken, held a familiarity he could not immediately place, a detail that tugged at memory like a thread just out of reach. And he felt it then, faint but undeniable, a shift inside him that had nothing to do with status or control, something older, something rooted in a past he rarely allowed himself to revisit. While across from him, Mai straightened just enough to shield her grandmother from the weight of the room, her voice finding strength where fear had been. "She has done nothing wrong," she said quietly, and the words lingered in the silence that followed, fragile but defiant, as every eye turned once more, waiting, judging, unaware that the moment they thought they controlled had already begun to slip beyond their understanding. The silence that followed her words did not break. It deepened, stretching across the room like a held breath no one dared release. And Kang Ji-hyun felt it settle into his chest as his gaze remained fixed on the old woman's hands, those same hands that had not trembled once under the weight of judgment, hands that carried something he could not yet name, but could not ignore. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he took another step forward, the soft sound of his shoes against the marble floor, finally drawing attention, one head turning, then another, until the ripple reached the center and the room collectively stilled, because now they saw him. Now they understood that he had been there all along. The fiancée straightened immediately, her expression smoothing into practiced elegance as she turned toward him. "You arrived earlier than expected," she said, her voice light, controlled, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the scene before him could be dismissed with a single glance. But he did not answer her, did not even acknowledge her presence, his eyes never leaving the old woman, and that absence of recognition was louder than any response. I felt it too, the shift, the way the attention that had once weighed down on her now moved past her, redirected towards something far more significant, and she dared to lift her gaze just slightly, enough to see the expression on his face, not anger, not confusion, but something far more unsettling, something quiet and searching, as if he were standing on the edge of a memory he could not fully reach. "Sir," the security guard spoke cautiously, unsure whether to intervene or step aside. "Shall I escort her out?" And the question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous, because everyone was waiting for the answer, for the confirmation that order would be restored, that the boundaries of status would be enforced, that the world still made sense. Kang Jae-hyun finally stopped a few feet away, close enough now, that the details became undeniable, the faint lines etched into the woman's skin, the steady way she held herself, the quiet dignity that refused to bend under scrutiny. And his eyes dropped once more to her hands, to the slight curve of her fingers, to something so specific, so precise, that it struck him without warning. A memory breaking through the walls he had built around it. A small room years ago, the scent of worn wood and warm tea, a voice telling him to hold still, to be patient, to believe that strength was not measured by how high you stood, but by how deeply you could bow when it mattered. His breath slowed, and for a moment, the present blurred with the past, the polished luxury of the penthouse dissolving into something far simpler, far more human. And he realized then that this was not familiarity, born of chance. This was recognition, undeniable and absolute. The fiancée took a small step closer, her smile tightening at the edges. "This is unnecessary," she said, her tone softer now, but edged with urgency. She should not be here. But again, he did not respond, and the dismissal was no longer subtle. It was clear, unmistakable, and the room felt it, the shift in power, the unraveling of expectation. Mai stood frozen, her heart pounding as she watched the man she had only ever known from a distance, a figure of authority she never dared to meet directly, now standing in front of her grandmother as if the rest of the world no longer existed. And for the first time, uncertainty replaced her fear, because something was happening that she could not explain, something that no one in that room had anticipated. Kang Ji-hyun lifted his gaze slowly, meeting the old woman's eyes, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them, something that needed no words, and the room, filled with wealth and certainty only moments before, now felt small, fragile, as if it were waiting to be redefined by what he would do next. For a moment that felt longer than it should have, neither of them spoke. And yet everything that needed to be understood seemed to pass between their eyes. Because Kang Ji-hyun was no longer looking at a stranger, he was looking at a piece of his past that he had buried beneath years of power and distance. And the realization settled into him with a quiet weight that no one else in the room could feel. The old woman did not bow, did not step back, did not offer the deference that everyone else expected. Instead, she held his gaze with the same calm steadiness, as if she had always known this moment would come, as if she had been waiting not for recognition, but for him to remember. A faint murmur rippled through the guests, confusion replacing certainty as they watched the exchange unfold. Because something was wrong, something did not follow the rules they understood, and the fiancée felt it most of all, her composure tightening as she stepped forward again, her voice softer now, but edged with insistence. "Ji-hyun, this is not appropriate," she said, using his name as if it could anchor him back into the world she controlled. "People are watching." But the words did not reach him, or if they did, they held no weight because his attention had already moved beyond the expectations of the room. Mai stood just behind her grandmother, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The man she had only ever known as distant and untouchable, now standing still, almost hesitant, as if the next step mattered more than anything he had done that evening. And she felt a strange pull in her chest, a mixture of fear and something else she could not name, something that told her this moment was about to change everything. Kang Ji-hyun's gaze dropped once more, not out of avoidance, but out of recognition, and slowly, deliberately, he took a step closer, closing the final distance between them, the sound of his movement echoing softly in the silence. And the room leaned in without realizing it, every breath held, every assumption suspended, his shoulders, always straight, always carrying the quiet authority that defined him, shifted almost imperceptibly, as if releasing something unseen, and then, without announcement, without explanation, he lowered his head, not quickly, not reluctantly, but with a controlled, deliberate motion that carried more meaning than any words he could have spoken, a gesture that belonged to a different time, a different set of values, one that no one in that room had expected to witness. The effect was immediate, absolute. The murmurs died, the faint clinking of glasses ceased, even the music seemed to fade into nothing, because the image before them did not make sense. The most powerful man in the room, the one they all measured themselves against, standing in quiet humility before a woman they had dismissed only moments ago. The fiancée froze where she stood, her expression breaking for the first time as disbelief replaced control, her eyes moving between him and the old woman as if searching for an explanation that would restore order. But none came, and the absence of explanation made the moment heavier, undeniable. I felt her breath catch as she stared, her mind struggling to reconcile what she knew with what she was seeing, because this was not a gesture given lightly, not something done for show. It was real, deeply real, and her grandmother, who had faced the judgment of the room without flinching, now softened in the smallest of ways, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if she had always known that beneath everything he had become, there was still a part of him that remembered. And in that silence, with his head bowed and the world watching, the balance of the room shifted completely, not with noise or force, but with something far more powerful, the quiet, undeniable presence of respect. No one spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because something far deeper had taken hold of the room, something that made every voice feel out of place, and Kang Ji-hyun remained in that bowed position for a fraction longer than anyone expected, long enough for the meaning to settle into every corner of the penthouse, long enough for the illusion of hierarchy to begin unraveling in front of those who had believed in it so completely. When he finally straightened, he did not rush, did not look around for approval or reaction, his movements as controlled as ever, but now carrying a weight that shifted how he was seen, not just as a man of power, but as someone bound by something older than status, something that demanded respect regardless of who was watching. The old woman's expression softened, not into a smile, but into a quiet acknowledgement, a subtle change that spoke of recognition rather than surprise, as if she had always known that beneath everything he had built, he had not forgotten what truly mattered. And for a brief moment, the two of them stood in a silence that excluded the rest of the world entirely. Then, without raising his voice, Kang Ji-hyun spoke, his tone calm, measured, but carrying a clarity that cut through the air. "She stays," he said, and the simplicity of the statement made it impossible to challenge, because it was not a suggestion, it was not a negotiation, it was a decision, and it landed with more force than any command. The fiancée's composure cracked just enough to be seen, her lips parting as if to respond, to reclaim control, but the words did not come immediately, because for the first time that evening, she was no longer certain of her position, no longer certain that the rules she relied on would hold. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another as if searching for confirmation that what they had just witnessed had truly happened, that the man they admired, feared, and respected had just lowered himself before someone they had dismissed without a second thought. Mai stood frozen, her mind struggling to keep pace with the unfolding reality, her heart still racing, but now with something different, something that felt less like fear and more like disbelief, because the weight she had carried for so long, the quiet acceptance of being overlooked, of being less than, was beginning to crack in a way she had never imagined. Kang Ji-hyun turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room, not lingering on any one person, but making it clear that he saw everything, the whispers, the judgment, the subtle expressions that had revealed more than words ever could. And when his eyes briefly met those of his fiancée, the message was unmistakable, a boundary drawn without the need for explanation. "You will treat her with respect," he continued, his voice steady, directed not at one individual, but at everyone present, and the phrasing left no room for interpretation, because it did not ask for agreement. It required it. The old woman finally moved, not stepping back, not shrinking under the attention, but simply adjusting her posture, her hands still steady, her presence unchanged, as if the validation of the room meant little compared to something far more personal that had already been resolved. And in that moment, as the balance of the evening shifted completely, as the laughter that once filled the space dissolved into a careful, uneasy quiet, it became clear that this was no longer just a gathering of wealth and status. It had become something else entirely, a moment that would not be forgotten, because it had revealed something none of them had expected to see, not just power, but humility, not just control, but memory, and for the first time, The room understood that the measure of a person was not where they stood, but what they chose to honor when it mattered most. The room did not return to what it had been. Not after a single sentence had redrawn every invisible line they once trusted, and the silence that followed Kang Ji-hyun's words was no longer filled with judgment, but with something far more fragile. Uncertainty, because no one quite knew where they stood anymore. Not in relation to him. Not in relation to the woman they had dismissed so easily. The guests who had once leaned in with quiet amusement now shifted their posture, straightening their jackets, lowering their voices, their earlier confidence dissolving into careful restraint, because power had spoken, but not in the way they expected, and that difference unsettled them more than any display of authority ever could. Mai felt it in the way the air moved, in the absence of laughter, in the sudden politeness that replaced the subtle cruelty from before, and she stood beside her grandmother, no longer trying to pull her away, no longer apologizing, but still unsure of how to exist. In this new space that had opened without warning, Kang Ji-hyun turned slightly toward her, his gaze softer now, though still unreadable to anyone else. And for the first time, he addressed her directly, not as staff, not as someone passing through the background of his world, but as a person standing in front of him. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice calm, and the question itself carried a quiet shift, because it acknowledged her presence in a way he never had before. Mai hesitated for a fraction of a second, her voice catching before she answered. "My name is Mai." And though she spoke clearly, the years of keeping her head down lingered in the way she held herself, as if she still expected to disappear once the moment passed. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before his attention returned to the woman beside her, and something in his expression changed again, not with hesitation this time, but with a quiet resolve that came from understanding fully what he was seeing. "You have traveled far," he said to the grandmother, his tone respectful, not performative, not for the benefit of the room, but directed entirely at her. And the statement was simple, yet it carried an awareness that no one else in the room possessed, because he was not speaking about distance measured in miles, but about something much deeper, something lived, something endured. The old woman inclined her head slightly, the gesture neither submissive nor proud, but balanced, as if she accepted his recognition without needing to confirm it, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and warm. "Some journeys are longer than they look," she said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet weight that no one dared interrupt. The fiancée stood just behind him now, her presence still polished, but no longer commanding, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to regain footing in a situation that no longer followed her expectations. "This is becoming a distraction," she said, her voice controlled, but there was a subtle tension beneath it, a need to re-establish order. "We have guests waiting," and though the statement was reasonable, it no longer carried the authority it once did. Kang Ji-hyun did not turn to her immediately, and that pause, that deliberate delay, made the distance between them more visible than any argument could have, and when he finally spoke, his tone remained calm, but it no longer aligned with hers. "They can wait," he said, and the simplicity of the response made it final. A few guests exchanged glances, understanding now that this was no longer just an interruption. It was a moment that had taken priority over everything else, and no one dared challenge it. Mai looked between them, her heart still racing, but now filled with something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of understanding, because whatever connection existed between this man and her grandmother, it was real, it was powerful, and it had just shifted the entire room without force, without spectacle, only through the quiet, undeniable presence of truth. The room waited, not out of courtesy, but because something unseen had taken control of the moment, something that made every second feel deliberate, and Kang Ji-hyun stood there with a stillness that no longer felt distant but intentional, as if he were choosing each movement with care. And when he looked at the old woman again, there was no hesitation left, only clarity, the kind that comes when memory finally aligns with truth. "Do you remember?" he began, his voice quieter now, yet carrying farther than before because every person in that room was listening whether they admitted it or not. A winter night, many years ago, when a boy stood outside a small house, too proud to ask for help, and the words landed softly, almost out of place in a setting filled with polished glass and controlled conversations, but they carried something deeper, something that did not belong to the present moment alone. I felt a slight shift beside her as her grandmother's posture changed just enough to reveal recognition, not surprise, but the quiet acknowledgement of a story she had not expected to hear spoken aloud in a place like this, and the old woman's eyes softened, her voice calm as she answered. There was a boy who refused to come inside, even when the cold made his hands shake, and a faint murmur moved through the room. Confusion mixing with curiosity as the guests struggled to connect the story with the man standing before them. The man. They thought they understood. Kang Ji-hyun gave a small nod, his gaze steady. He said he did not need kindness, he continued, because he believed strength meant standing alone. And as he spoke, the distance between who he had been and who he had become seemed to narrow, revealing something far more human beneath the layers of control and authority. But you opened the door anyway, he added, his voice lowering slightly. And you told him that strength was not about pride, it was about knowing when to accept help and when to give it. And the words settled into the silence with a weight that shifted everything, because this was no longer a misunderstanding, no longer a question of identity. It was a revelation. The fiancée's expression tightened as she listened, her earlier confidence fading into something sharper, something uncertain, because this was a part of him she had never seen, a part that did not align with the image she had built and the guests who had once judged. So easily now stood motionless, their assumptions unraveling piece by piece as the truth revealed itself without force. Maya's heart pounded as she looked between them, her mind racing to understand how the grandmother she had always known, the woman who lived simply, who never spoke of the past, could be connected to the man who controlled everything around her. And yet the connection was undeniable, woven into every word, every glance, every quiet pause. The old woman finally smiled, not broadly, not for show, but with a warmth that carried years of memory. You were stubborn, she said gently, but you listened in the end. And there was no accusation in her tone, only a quiet pride that spoke of something nurtured long ago. Kang Ji-hyun exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to release something he had held for years. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a steadiness that reached beyond the room. You gave me more than warmth that night, he said. You gave me something I built my life on. And the statement hung there, simple yet profound, because it reframed everything, not just who she was, but who he was as well. And in that moment, as the truth fully settled into the space, the room understood what they had failed to see from the beginning, that the woman they had dismissed carried a legacy far greater than any title or wealth, and that the man they admired stood where he was, not only because of power, but because of a kindness he had never forgotten. The truth did not explode across the room. It settled slowly and heavily, like something that had always been there, but had finally been seen, and no one moved, not because they were told to remain still, but because they no longer trusted their own instincts, the same instincts that had led them to judge, to laugh, to dismiss. And now those same instincts felt fragile, exposed. As Kang Ji-hyun stood before the woman who had shaped a part of his life no one in that room had ever known. The silence stretched, not empty but full, filled with the weight of realization, and the guests who had once carried themselves with effortless confidence now avoided direct eye contact, their posture shifting, their expressions tightening, because the rules had changed without warning and they were no longer certain how to stand within them. I felt it most clearly, the shift not just in the room, but within herself, the quiet breaking of something she had accepted for years, the belief that people like her grandmother, were meant to remain unseen, to move quietly through spaces that were never truly theirs, and now that belief no longer held the same power, because it had been challenged not by words, but by truth. Her grandmother stood beside her, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence, as if nothing about this moment surprised her, as if she had lived her entire life knowing that dignity did not need to announce itself. It simply waited to be recognized. Kang Ji-hyun turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room once more. But this time, there was no question in it. No searching, only certainty. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a calm authority that felt different from before, not colder, not sharper, but grounded in something deeper, something that no longer needed to prove itself. There are people in this world, he said, his words measured, deliberate, who build their lives on what they have. And he paused, allowing the statement to settle before continuing. And there are those who build their lives on what they give. And the distinction hung in the air, simple yet undeniable, because everyone in that room understood exactly where they had stood just moments ago. The fiancée shifted slightly, her composure still intact, but no longer unshaken, her eyes narrowing as she tried to find a place within this new reality. "This is not necessary," she said, her voice controlled, though the certainty behind it had faded. "You are making a scene," and the words, once powerful, now felt misplaced, as if they belonged to a moment that had already passed. Kang Ji-hyun turned his head just enough to acknowledge her presence, but his expression did not change, and when he responded, his tone remained even. "No," he said simply, "this is clarity," and the difference between the two words was enough to silence any further objection, because clarity did not ask for permission, it revealed what was already true. Mai looked at her grandmother, her chest tightening with emotion she could no longer contain, because the woman who had raised her, who had taught her to endure without bitterness, to stand without pride, was now being seen in a way that felt long overdue, and yet her grandmother did not seek validation, did not react to the attention. She simply stood, grounded in who she had always been. And as the room adjusted, as the laughter faded into careful silence, as the weight of judgment gave way to something far more humbling, it became clear that this moment was not about power, not about status, but about something far more lasting, something that could not be bought or displayed, only lived. And for the first time that evening, the room understood that respect was not something they could decide. It was something that failed to recognize until it stood directly in front of them. No one returned to their conversations. No one reached for their glasses, because something had shifted too deeply to be ignored, and the room that once thrived on quiet judgment now stood in a rare, unspoken humility, as if every person present had been forced to confront something they had never questioned before. Kang Ji-hyun did not move immediately, his presence still anchored in front of the woman who had quietly shaped a part of his life long before any of them had known his name. And when he finally stepped back, it was not to create distance, but to restore balance, to give her space not as someone lesser, but as someone equal in dignity. And that distinction was felt by everyone watching. Mai stood beside her grandmother, her eyes no longer lowered, her posture no longer folded into itself, because something inside her had shifted as well, something that could not be undone. The realization that worth was not granted by rooms like this, but revealed in moments like this. And as she looked at the people who had once made her feel invisible, she saw something different now. Not superiority, not certainty, but hesitation, even discomfort, as if they were unsure how to meet her gaze. The fiancée remained still, her expression carefully composed, but the control she once held over the room had slipped, replaced by a quiet distance that no longer aligned her with him. And though she said nothing more, the silence between them spoke clearly, because some moments do not require confrontation to reveal what has already changed. Kang Ji-hyun turned slightly toward the guests, his gaze steady, his presence once again filling the room. But now it carried something more than authority. It carried intention. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, yet final. "Tonight continues," he said, but not as it began, and the words settled into the space like a line drawn, not to divide, but to redefine, and no one questioned it. No one challenged it, because they understood that the meaning behind it reached far beyond the event itself. A server moved quietly in the background, adjusting a tray, the faint sound of glass returning to the air, But even as the surface of the evening attempted to resume, the atmosphere remained changed, softer, more aware, as if every action now carried a weight it had not before. The old woman glanced at Mai, her eyes warm, her expression gentle, and in that small, private moment, there was no need for explanation, no need for words, because everything that mattered had already been understood, and Mai felt it, a quiet strength settling in her chest. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, something she would carry long after this night ended. Kang Ji-hyun gave a final, respectful nod to the woman before turning away, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement, as if closing a circle that had remained open for years. And as he walked back into the center of the room, the guests instinctively made space, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because they had just witnessed something that could not be undone. Conversations slowly returned, but they were different now, quieter, more careful, as if each word was weighed before being spoken, and the laughter that eventually followed carried none of the sharpness it once had. And in that penthouse high above the city, where status had once defined every interaction, something else had taken its place, something quieter but far more powerful, a reminder that dignity does not depend on where you stand, only on what you carry within you. And that night, without raising his voice, without forcing a single command, the most powerful man in the room had shown them all what it means to recognize it.